My mother-in-law thought she could burn my grandmother's legacy and leave me with nothing but ashes. She didn't realize that when you back someone into a furnace, you aren't just destroying them, you're forging a monster. The wedding dress wasn't just silk, lace, and beadwork. It was a testament to every sacrifice I'd made over the last decade. My grandmother had spent her final months hand-stitching the bodice, her frail fingers working by the dim light of a bedside lamp so she could see me walk down the aisle. It was vintage, delicate, and irreplaceable. When I hung it in the guest room closet, the only room with a lock, or so I thought, I felt a sense of peace. I was getting married in 3 days. Everything was perfect. Or, at least, everything was supposed to be. My mother-in-law, Diane, had never been subtle about her disdain for me. To her, I was a transient influence on her son, a girl from the wrong side of the tracks who didn't understand the family legacy. She had spent months trying to veto my choices, the venue, the catering, even the invitation font, but she hadn't touched the dress. I thought it was because she knew the boundary. I was wrong. I came home from my final fitting feeling like a queen, only to find the guest room door standing wide open. The smell hit me before I even crossed the threshold, a pungent, acrid scent of charred synthetic fibers and burning chemicals. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I rushed inside and my breath hitched in my throat. The closet door was hanging off its hinges, and on the floor lay a heap of black, greasy ash. The dress was gone. In its place was a blackened metal hanger and a few singed sequins that still glowed a dull, angry orange. There was no fire, just the aftermath of a deliberate, calculated incineration. I stood there, paralyzed, the silence of the house pressing in on me until it felt like physical weight. Then, I heard the faint, rhythmic sound of heels clicking on the hardwood in the kitchen below. Diane was humming a hymn, the sound sickeningly cheerful. I walked toward the kitchen, my footsteps silent, my hands trembling with a rage so cold it turned my blood to ice. As I rounded the corner, I saw her standing by the stove, holding a pair of heavy-duty kitchen shears, casually clipping the lace remnants of my grandmother's veil into tiny, meaningless confetti. She looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to a smug, thin-lipped smile. "I figured you'd want to start your new life without baggage," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "It was an eyesore, dear." The room spun. I felt something snap inside my chest, a dark, heavy anchor dropping into the deepest part of my soul. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just watched her drop the shears onto the granite countertop with a sharp clack. I knew, in that exact second, that the woman standing before me was no longer my future family. She was an obstacle that needed to be permanently cleared. I turned away from her, my mind racing through the logistics of the house. I knew the layout better than she did. The old wiring, the gas line she constantly complained about, the way the kitchen ventilation hood had been buzzing for weeks. I walked to the pantry and pulled out a bottle of high-proof cooking sherry, then grabbed a box of matches from the drawer where she kept her expensive scented candles. My hands were perfectly steady now. I walked past her, brushing her shoulder, and felt her flinch at the icy intensity of my gaze. I moved to the stove, dialed the burner to high, and watched as the flame sputtered to life. She was still watching me, confused, perhaps expecting me to break down. Instead, I poured the alcohol along the perimeter of the cabinets, my eyes locked onto hers, daring her to speak. She opened her mouth to scoff, to tell me I was being dramatic, but the look in my eyes must have finally registered as something dangerous. Her smugness faltered, her face pale under the kitchen lights. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice finally cracking. I didn't answer. I reached for a nearby dish towel, soaked it in the spilled liquid, and draped it over the burner, watching the fire catch instantly. It climbed the wood, licked the wallpaper, and began to roar toward the ceiling. I stepped back, blocking the kitchen entrance, and watched the smoke begin to curl toward the vents. "This kitchen has always been your sanctuary, Diane," I said, my voice eerily calm as the fire began to feed on the cabinets. "Let's see if you can still rule over the ashes." She lunged toward the exit, but I shifted my weight, locking eyes with her as the fire blocked her only path to the living room, trapping us both in a rapidly heating furnace. The heat was immediate, a physical wall that shoved itself against my skin. Diane shrieked, a high-pitched, jagged sound that cut through the low, hungry roar of the flames. The cherrywood cabinets, which she had bragged about costing more than my first car, were now weeping black sap, turning into fuel for the beast I'd unleashed. The fire hadn't just caught, it had claimed the room with a terrifying, rhythmic intensity. "Get out of my way!" she screamed, her composure shattering into a frantic, clawing desperation. She swung her purse at me, a heavy, expensive leather bag that caught me on the shoulder, but I didn't budge. I stood like a statue in the doorway, the temperature climbing until the air felt thin and metallic. I looked at her, really looked at her. Her face, usually polished and composed, was melting into a mask of pure, unadulterated fear. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had spent months trying to burn my spirit down, trying to strip away my confidence in my history, and now the very kitchen where she had sat and insulted my background was returning the favor. "The front door is too far, Diane," I said, my voice barely audible over the crackle of burning drywall. "And the smoke is already filling the hallway. You really should have serviced those vents like the inspector told you." She backed away, stumbling over a bar stool, her eyes darting toward the window, a high, narrow transom that wouldn't budge. She was trapped, and for the first time in her life, she realized that money and status meant absolutely nothing when the world was literally burning around you. She lunged for the back utility door, the one that led to the garage, but I was faster. I stepped into the kitchen, the flames licking at the hem of my jeans, and kicked the heavy wooden chair over, creating a barricade between her and the only exit. "You burned my past," I shouted, the rage finally bubbling to the surface, raw and jagged. "You burned the only thing I had left of her. Did you think I would just walk away? Did you think I was weak?" Diane fell to her knees, coughing as the smoke began to curl into a thick black snake along the ceiling. "It was just a dress," she wheezed, clawing at her throat. "It was old, filthy rags. I did you a favor." Her words hit me like a physical blow, but instead of making me shrink, they ignited a furnace inside my chest that was hotter than the blaze consuming her pantry. I stepped closer, the heat searing my face, and looked down at her. She looked pathetic, a queen of dust and ego, now begging for mercy from the girl she'd spent months trying to exile. "It wasn't a dress, Diane," I whispered, leaning down so my lips were inches from her ear, the heat from the cabinet singeing my hair. "It was a legacy, and you just watched it turn to ash." I heard the sound of the house groaning, the structural supports beginning to bow under the sudden, violent surge of heat. The ceiling fan above us flickered, sparks raining down like fiery snow. Suddenly, the kitchen fire alarm erupted, a deafening, rhythmic wail that seemed to scream for help. But there was no one for miles. We were in the middle of nowhere, in a house meant to be a fortress, and I had ensured that the fortress was falling. I turned to leave, ready to exit through the back mudroom, but as I reached for the handle, I felt a sharp, burning grip on my ankle. Diane had crawled toward me, her manicured nails digging into my skin with the strength of someone terrified of dying. She pulled herself up, her face streaked with soot and mascara, her eyes wide and pleading. "You can't leave me," she choked out, her voice trembling. If I die here, they'll know. They'll find out you did this. You'll never get away with it. I stared down at her hand on my leg, then back to her face. I didn't feel pity. I felt a cold, calculated curiosity. The garage door suddenly buckled inward, not from the fire, but from the weight of the shifting roof. A massive beam of burning timber crashed down, slamming into the kitchen island and splitting the floorboards between us. The impact sent a shockwave through the room, and I lost my footing. I hit the floor hard, and as the dust settled, I realized the exit was completely blocked. The fire had jumped the gap, surrounding us in a ring of red, pulsing light. I looked up to see a massive, floor-to-ceiling cabinet swaying precariously above us, its glass doors already shattering from the heat, and in that split second I saw a metallic glint from the debris. A heavy, sharpened kitchen knife sliding toward me across the scorched hardwood. The knife skidded to a halt inches from my outstretched hand, the steel reflecting the hungry orange glow of the encroaching wall of flame. I didn't reach for it. My focus was entirely on Diane. She had let go of my ankle, distracted by the sound of the structural collapse, her eyes darting between the falling debris and the path I had intended to take. She was breathing in short, shallow gasps, her lungs clearly failing against the thickening soot. "Help me," she whispered, the arrogance completely purged from her voice, replaced by a raw, guttural animal instinct. "Please, I have money, I have connections. I can make this go away, just get us out." I slowly stood up, my boots crunching on the shattered glass of her expensive cabinetry. I looked at the wall of fire, then back at her. The heat was blistering now, peeling the wallpaper in long, agonizing strips. My own skin felt tight, burned by the proximity of the inferno, but the pain felt secondary, a distant hum compared to the roaring void of my resolve. "You didn't help me when I begged you to stop, Diane," I said, my voice cutting through the hiss of burning grease. "You stood there and laughed while you reduced my grandmother's history to nothing. Do you really think I'm going to spend the last few minutes of my life saving the person who ensured I'd never have one?" She scrambled backward, hitting the center island, her eyes wide with the realization that I wasn't just a threat. I was the judge, jury, and executioner. She clawed at the kitchen drawers, pulling them out, desperately searching for a phone that had already melted into a plastic puddle. She was trapped in the kitchen, and I was trapped in the house. The fire had taken the hallway, and the garage exit was a collapsed mess of flaming timber. Suddenly, a sound echoed from the front of the house, a loud, rhythmic pounding on the heavy oak front door. My heart skipped. "Help!" Someone had seen the smoke. Diane's eyes lit up. "They're here!" she shrieked, coughing violently. "They'll save us! And I will tell them exactly what you did. I'll tell them you started it." She began to crawl toward the kitchen archway, ignoring the heat searing her knees, her eyes fixed on the distant front door. She was going to make it to the living room, and if she made it to the rescuers, my life would be over. The legal repercussions, the social destruction, the utter erasure of my future, it all hinged on whether or not she reached that door. I looked at the heavy, serrated blade on the floor. I looked at the back door of the kitchen, which was now blocked by a wall of fire. But I noticed something she hadn't: the service dumbwaiter. It was a relic from the 1920s, a small wooden shaft hidden behind the pantry shelving that led down to the cellar. It was small, tight, and smelled of rot, but it was the only way out of the kitchen that didn't involve walking through a literal furnace. Diane was halfway to the living room archway, dragging herself with a desperate, pathetic crawl. She was close, so close that she was already shouting, "Help! Help me! She's trying to kill me!" I lunged for the pantry. I shoved the burning shelves aside, my hands blistering, and clawed at the small brass handle of the dumbwaiter door. It was stuck, jammed by the heat warping the surrounding wood. I kicked it, once, twice, the wood splintering under my weight. It gave way, revealing a dark, cramped shaft. I looked back one last time. Diane was pulling herself up onto her feet near the living room entrance, pointing a shaking finger back at me, her face a mask of triumph. "You're going to prison!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she neared the safety of the foyer. I dove headfirst into the shaft just as the main ceiling joist gave way. The entire kitchen exploded in a shower of sparks and falling plaster, the floor beneath Diane's feet groaning ominously. I felt the shaft walls closing in on me, the wood around me beginning to smolder, and as I scrambled downward into the pitch-black abyss of the cellar, I heard the front door finally burst open, followed by the terrifying, familiar voice of my fiancé screaming his mother's name. I hit the bottom of the shaft with a bone-jarring thud, but as I caught my breath in the stifling dark, I heard a second, heavier voice, the local police officer, call out, "Ma'am, step away from the debris. Is there anyone else in there?" And then, the most terrifying thing happened. I heard Diane, alive and seemingly coherent, let out a jagged, triumphant laugh as she replied, "Yes, find her, and don't let her leave." The air in the cellar was cold, thin, and tasted of wet limestone, a jarring contrast to the furnace raging directly above my head. I scrambled to my feet, my adrenaline masking the sharp, stabbing pain in my ribs where I'd hit the bottom of the dumbwaiter. Above me, the floorboards groaned under the weight of firemen and police, their heavy boots thudding against the ceiling like war drums. I didn't have time to process the sheer audacity of Diane's lie. She had played the victim flawlessly, likely framing her collapse as an attack while the house burned down around us. I knew my fiancé Mark was up there. He was a man of logic and, more importantly, a man who worshipped his mother's fragile version of reality. If he found me down here, covered in soot, with the scent of cooking sherry still clinging to my clothes, he wouldn't even wait for a trial. He'd tear me apart himself. I moved through the darkness, my hands brushing against damp stone walls. The cellar was an old coal bin, long ago converted into storage for Diane's heirlooms, hundreds of boxes I had been forbidden to touch. I stumbled over a trunk, the lid falling open to reveal silk curtains and velvet drapes. The irony was suffocating. She lived in a museum of things she didn't care about, while I had been trying to salvage one piece of my own soul. A beam of light pierced the darkness from the far corner. It wasn't a flashlight. It was the glow of the fire, already licking its way down the internal wall studs. The house was a skeleton, and it was collapsing inward. I saw the rusted iron grate of the coal chute, the only other way out. I rushed toward it, my fingers catching on the cold, jagged metal. I pushed, but it was bolted from the outside, a security measure she had installed months ago to keep intruders out. "Help!" I screamed, slamming my palms against the iron. "I'm down here. The house is going to collapse." The floor above me shuddered. Dust and debris rained down, choking me. I heard a muffled voice, not Mark's, but a stranger's, a firefighter. "We have a structural integrity issue. Everyone out. The whole east wing is coming down." My heart stopped. If they retreated now, they were sealing my tomb. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the corner and jammed it into the hinge of the grate. I levered my entire body weight against it, my muscles screaming in protest. The metal shrieked, protesting the torque, and I felt the bolt give just a fraction of an inch. Then, the ceiling directly above the dumbwaiter shaft gave way with a sound like a cannon blast. A section of the kitchen floor, still carrying the weight of the massive marble island, plummeted into the basement, crushing the area where I had been standing just seconds before. The force of the impact knocked the wind out of me, throwing me into a pile of wooden crates. Silence followed, thick and heavy. Then, the sound of footsteps, cautious, heavy, and rhythmic, descended the wooden stairs at the far end of the cellar. They weren't moving like a fireman. They were slow, deliberate. "I know you're down here," a voice called out. It wasn't the police officer. It wasn't Mark. It was Diane. The tone of her voice had shifted from the hysterical victim to something cold, clinical, and predatory. She was no longer gasping for air. She was steady, calm, and terrifyingly lucid. I pressed myself into the shadows behind a stack of moth-eaten rugs, my chest heaving, trying to stay silent. "The officers are busy with the fire, dear," she called out, her heels clicking softly on the concrete. "They think I'm safe in the ambulance. They have no idea I came back for the one thing I couldn't let you destroy." She clicked on a high-intensity tactical flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom like a scalpel, sweeping across the cellar floor. It hit a box, a crate, a mirror. I held my breath, my lungs burning, waiting for the light to hit the rugs. I looked down at my hand and realized, with a sickening jolt, that in the panic of the fall, I had dropped my phone. The ringtone suddenly shattered the silence, a shrill, persistent melody that sounded like a scream in the quiet tomb of the cellar. It was Mark calling. The light swung instantly, pinning me against the wall. Diane stood at the bottom of the stairs, her silhouette framed by the flickering orange inferno behind her. She wasn't just holding a light, she was holding a heavy, iron-headed fireplace tool she'd dragged from the wreckage above. "Found you," she whispered, her eyes devoid of anything human. She took a step toward me, but as she did, the ceiling above the stairs groaned, a final, fatal sound, and a massive, burning support beam snapped, effectively cutting off the stairs and trapping both of us in a rapidly shrinking triangle of space as the house began its final, violent descent into the earth. The ceiling beam didn't just fall, it disintegrated, slamming into the stairs with the force of a wrecking ball. The impact pulverized the wooden steps and buried the basement entrance under a mountain of smoldering, splintered timber. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of shifting debris and the distant, fading siren of a fire engine. Diane was cut off from the world, and so was I. The flashlight she held skittered across the concrete, its beams spinning crazily before landing on a pile of old newspapers, illuminating her face in a ghoulish, flickering light. She looked unhinged, her expensive silk blouse shredded, her face streaked with a mixture of soot and blood. She didn't look like a society matron anymore. She looked like a cornered animal, realizing that its cage had finally locked from the outside. She lunged for the iron poker, her eyes locked onto mine with a hunger that defied the encroaching smoke. "You ruined everything," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a decade's worth of suppressed vitriol. "My home, my legacy, my reputation. You think you're so righteous? You're just a parasite who finally got burned." I didn't back away. I couldn't. I was pinned against the foundation wall, the heat now radiating through the very stones behind me. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold, jagged edge of the piece of glass I had grabbed from the wreckage of the dumbwaiter. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "The legacy was already dead, Diane," I said, my voice eerily steady. "You killed it the moment you decided that hurting me was worth more than the family you claimed to love. You didn't burn my dress because it was an eyesore. You burned it because you couldn't stand the idea of me having something that was purely, irrevocably mine." She roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated hatred, and swung the heavy iron tool toward my head. I ducked, the metal whistling through the air where my skull had been a second before, slamming into the wall with a shower of sparks. I didn't hesitate. I lunged forward, not away from her, but into her guard. I slammed my shoulder into her midsection, knocking the wind out of her, and as she stumbled back, I drove the shard of glass into the only thing she truly cared about, the heavy, antique locket she wore around her neck. The one she claimed held the ashes of her own ancestors, a piece of jewelry that was her absolute pride. The chain snapped. The locket hit the concrete and shattered, the contents spilling out in a fine gray mist that vanished into the soot-filled air. Diane froze. Her face turned ash gray. She fell to her knees, scrambling to scoop up the nothingness from the floor, her hands trembling violently. "No, no, no, no," she sobbed, the predatory fire in her eyes instantly replaced by a hollow, broken vacancy. "Everything. It's gone." Everything. She was so consumed by the loss of the trinket that she didn't notice the foundation wall behind her, the one weakened by the fire and the massive beam collapse, beginning to buckle. A hairline fracture spiderwebbed across the stones, growing wider by the millisecond. "Diane, move!" I screamed, the instinct to survive overriding the desire for revenge. She didn't hear me. She was staring at her empty palms. The wall groaned and then vanished. A torrent of earth, ash, and structural debris poured into the cellar like a dam breaking. I threw myself into the crawl space under the old coal chute, shielding my head as the world turned into a thundering avalanche of darkness. When I finally opened my eyes, the air was eerily still. The fire had been smothered by the collapse of the earth. I was buried, but there was a sliver of light, a gap between the fallen stones that led to the outside world. I clawed my way upward, my fingernails bleeding, my muscles screaming, until I pushed through the loose dirt and tumbled out into the cold, damp grass of the backyard. I lay there for a long time, watching the stars above the smoldering ruin of the house. I could hear them calling her name, Mark's voice raw and broken, and the shouting of the rescue crews. I stood up, my clothes in rags, my body a map of bruises and burns, and walked toward the edge of the property. I didn't look back. I didn't wait to be found. I walked until I reached the main road, disappearing into the shadows just as the first sirens crested the hill. Diane had wanted me to be homeless, to be empty-handed, to be baggage-free. As I walked away from the flickering glow of the ruins, I realized she had finally gotten her wish. I had nothing left. No dress, no family, no future as I had once imagined it. But as the morning sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the world in a color that wasn't the dull gray of ash or the angry red of fire, I took a deep breath. For the first time in 10 years, the air didn't taste like her expectations. It tasted like nothing at all. And for the first time, that was enough.